A stone bird once stood high above Great Zimbabwe, watching granite walls rise across a southern African valley. Centuries later, colonial agents removed one of those birds and carried it south. They also used the ruins to advance a claim: Africans could not have built the city around it. That denial turned architecture into a weapon. Outsiders searched for Phoenicians, Arabs, Israelites, or the Queen of Sheba, because the simplest answer threatened the racial order they were building. Archaeology has answered that false mystery. Local African communities ancestral to Shona-speaking peoples built Great Zimbabwe. The harder questions begin there. How did they turn fractured granite, cattle, crops, craft, water, and regional exchange into a major political center? How did that center change without vanishing in a single collapse? And why, long after its power ebbed, did colonial observers still need its builders to be anyone but African? Great Zimbabwe is not one building. It is a landscape spread across roughly 720 hectares. The best-known remains form three broad zones: the hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and clusters of valley enclosures. Between and beyond them lay houses, courtyards, workshops, cattle spaces, paths, fields, and water sources. Stone creates a powerful illusion because it survives. Much of the city was built from Dhaka, a mixture of granitic sand and clay used for walls, floors, platforms, and benches. Roofs depended on timber and thatch. Fire, rain, roots, rebuilding, farming, and time erased much of that softer architecture. The stone city we see is not the whole settlement. It is the durable edge of a larger city that has mostly returned to earth. The granite itself came from the surrounding landscape. Exposed rock naturally fractured into useful slabs. Builders selected and shaped portable blocks, then laid them in dry stone courses without mortar. Broad bases and tapering profiles distributed weight. Careful bedding, mass, friction, and generations of judgment allowed the walls to rise and remain stable. This was not one construction campaign. A Bayesian chronology combines radiocarbon dates, surviving layers, and datable imports. It suggests that major stone walling began near the end of the 12th or the start of the 13th century. Building reached its height during the 14th and 15th centuries. Walls and roots were altered as generations inherited older spaces. Great Zimbabwe was not designed once and completed. It accumulated. The Great Enclosure is the most spectacular result. Its outer wall runs for about 252 meters and reaches roughly 11 meters at its highest point. At the base, it can be up to 6 meters thick, narrowing as it rises. Inside are smaller enclosures, traces of earthen houses, a narrow parallel passage, and the solid conical tower. The architecture reveals intention without surrendering a single explanation. The passage compressed movement before space opened again. Walls divided courtyards, concealed some activities, framed entrances, and made coordinated labor visible. Architecture organized attention, but that does not prove one ritual script, one royal route, or one permanent use. The Great Enclosure has been called a fortress, palace, ritual center, and royal residence. Its functions remain debated and may have changed. The conical tower withholds even more. It has no known entrance and no agreed purpose. Granary, fertility symbol, royal emblem, and monument to abundance have all been proposed, but none is demonstrated. The same caution applies to the 8 known soapstone birds. Raised on tall columns and combining avian and human features, they are associated with status, ritual, and authority, while their precise meanings remain unsettled. The opening bird therefore stood within more than a stone spectacle. Around it were Dhaka houses, roofs, smoke, grain, animals, workshops, and people moving between walled and unwalled spaces. The surviving monument is a deliberate silhouette, not a complete portrait. To understand what sustained it, we have to leave the famous wall and follow wealth through the landscape. Great Zimbabwe stood far from the coast, but it was not isolated. Its power grew from overlapping systems of production and exchange. The most important began close to home: cattle, sorghum, pearl millet, finger millet, hunting, and the work of households. Cattle were wealth, food, and social value. They could also provide draft power. Grain sustained communities. Skins and ivory could circulate. Iron tools shaped fields and wood. Archaeologists have recovered crucibles and evidence of work in iron, copper, gold, bronze, and brass. Evidence from different homesteads points to multi-crafting, not one rigid class of specialists. Households farmed, tended animals, made pottery, spun cotton, or worked metal as circumstances required. Political authority could gather surplus through tribute and exchange, but the economy was broader than a royal warehouse. Great Zimbabwe drew strength from networks among households, mining zones, and regional centers. Some of those networks extended eastward toward Swahili ports on the Indian Ocean. Gold and ivory from the interior moved through many hands. In return came glass beads and glazed ceramics. Archaeologists have found objects connected to the East African coast, the Islamic world, and China, including coins associated with Kilwa and fragments of imported porcelain. It is tempting to turn these objects into a direct shipping route. Gold leaves Great Zimbabwe and a Chinese bowl returns. The evidence is more interesting. Goods could pass through layered African networks, changing owners repeatedly before reaching the interior. Imported ceramics were rare, probably fewer than 100 pieces in the surviving record, which made them powerful precisely because they were not ordinary. Their presence does not make the city foreign. An imported ceramic found in a local household proves contact, not colonization. The furnaces, pottery, food remains, walling tradition, and settlement sequence are local. External trade enlarged a political economy whose foundations were African. Great Zimbabwe was not created by the ocean network. It acted within it. The city may not have monopolized every mine, caravan, or transaction. Recent scholarship warns against imagining one rigid empire controlling all southern Africa from a stone throne. Multiple states and centers may have coexisted, bound at different times by cattle, tribute, kinship, ritual, craft, and commerce. Great Zimbabwe's achievement was therefore not simply possession of gold, it was the ability to turn circulation into meaning. A bead that crossed regions, a copper object from a distant source, or a rare glazed vessel could demonstrate access to a larger world. Global connections did not replace local foundations in cattle, crops, craft, and labor. They magnified them. Yet trade alone cannot explain the shape of inland life. We also have to ask how many people shared the valley and how they stored water through the dry season. For decades, popular accounts repeated a peak population of 10 or even 20,000. That number made Great Zimbabwe easier to compare with dense cities, but it encouraged a false choice. Either the site resembled a compact Eurasian capital, or it was somehow less urban. A 2017 demographic study challenged the 20,000 estimate. The archaeological deposits are not deep or dense enough across the whole site, and different neighborhoods once treated as simultaneous were occupied at different times. There are no vast rubbish mounds or industrial dumps of the scale such a permanent population should have produced. The city may have held far fewer people at any one moment than older reconstructions suggest. That does not shrink Great Zimbabwe. It changes the kind of city we are looking for. The evidence instead suggests a constellation of homesteads rather than continuous blocks of streets. Leaders, advisors, craftspeople, farmers, and herders might gather at a political center and disperse again. Authority could be urban without everyone sleeping behind one wall. The landscape functioned as a network, not a crowded grid. This dispersed form helps explain resilience. Farming land, pasture, woodland, and water could be used across a wider area. Households could shift activities instead of concentrating every demand at the monumental core. The masonry becomes more remarkable. A relatively small population organized labor over centuries to create walls that still dominate the valley. Water management reveals the same landscape intelligence. Large depressions around the monumental area were long described mainly as dhaka pits, scars left when builders removed clay for houses. Recent geoarchaeology, soil study, local knowledge, and airborne laser scanning suggest that some pits gained a second function. Positioned to catch runoff and groundwater, They may have acted as reservoirs connected with springs and wells. The map system may have held at least 18,000 cubic meters, although its dates and ancient capacity need further testing. No fantasy of pipes is required. Rain fell on granite slopes. The evidence suggests that people enlarged some depressions to retain runoff, combining stored water with springs and wells for households, animals, crops, and ritual needs. Clay taken out became walls. Some of the empty spaces may then have become water storage. One act could create material for houses in a basin that helps sustain them. Great Zimbabwe's deeper engineering story is not one miracle structure, but a chain of decisions linking geology, architecture, agriculture, water, and season. The city was therefore neither the packed metropolis of old textbooks nor an empty royal monument. It was a changing concentration of homes, sacred places, working spaces, animals, water, and visitors. Its urbanism was different, not deficient. And if its population and neighborhoods changed through time, the familiar story of one sudden abandonment also begins to break apart. The traditional ending is neat. Great Zimbabwe grows too large, exhausts its fields and forests, runs out of resources, and is abandoned around 1450. Power then moves to other centers such as Kami and the Mutapa state. This story appears in many summaries because it gives the ruins a single dramatic fall. The record is less obedient. Environmental pressure, political competition, changing trade routes, succession, and rising centers may all have influenced contraction, but no one cause is proved. A city that changed its footprint was not necessarily a failed one. Chronology also complicates the date. The grandest stone construction peaked in the 14th and 15th centuries, yet occupation continued into at least the 16th and probably the 17th. Excavations in unwalled areas have produced later radiocarbon dates, Kami period beads, and imported objects that do not fit a complete mid-15th century evacuation. Different parts of Great Zimbabwe expanded, contracted, and were reused at different times. Political authority may also have moved without every resident leaving. Leaders could rule from existing homesteads, while centers remained linked across a wide landscape. A shift in power did not require a final crowd walking through the gate. Monumental construction could slow. Tribute could follow another court. Trade could favor another route. Families could remain, return, or use the place in new ways. The safest image is not a switch turning off in 1450, but political influence ebbing and shifting. Kami rose in the southwest. Mutapa developed to the north. Great Zimbabwe's political centrality declined, but its people and traditions did not vanish. The site remains spiritually important to surrounding communities today. The phrase abandoned city is useful only if we specify what was abandoned, by whom, and when. A royal center can lose power without becoming empty. A neighborhood can move while a shrine remains active. A wall can fall out of political use while its meaning survives. Great Zimbabwe did not need a spectacular apocalypse. Its history is more human. Authority redistributed, settlement ebbed, and new centers inherited parts of an older world. The most violent break in the record came later, when outsiders arrived and began removing both objects and context. Local communities had never needed a European explorer to discover Great Zimbabwe. The place was known, named, and remembered. In 1871, it entered a Western argument about Africa. The German traveler Karl Mauch promoted a connection with the biblical Queen of Sheba. The claim was weak as archaeology and powerful as ideology. If a grand city existed in Africa, colonial thinking insisted, its creators must have come from elsewhere. Cecil Rhodes understood the political value of that story. In 1891, he commissioned the antiquarian James Theodore Bent to excavate the site. Bent searched for exotic origins and removed objects, including one soapstone bird from the hill complex's eastern enclosure, also called the Sacred Enclosure. Several complete birds and a fragment were sent to Cape Town. They would return to Zimbabwe only after independence in 1981. The damage was not limited to theft. Treasure hunters and excavators stripped deposits from major areas, especially the Great Enclosure. Richard Hall continued destructive work while arguing for foreign builders. Soil layers were discarded and objects lost their locations. Context, the information that turns a thing into history, vanished while investigators hunted for outsiders. The irony is severe. Men who claimed Africans could not have built Great Zimbabwe damaged the evidence that most clearly explained how Africans had built and occupied it. Modern researchers are still rebuilding that sequence from radiocarbon dates, surviving layers, legacy collections, oral history, and work in unwalled areas. Colonial excavation has made that task harder. Early 20th century excavations began to overturn the foreign builder story. David Randall McIver's work in 1905 and 1906 identified the material as medieval and African. In 1929, Gertrude Caton Thompson excavated less disturbed areas and reached the same conclusion. Later research connected the city firmly with ancestors of Shona-speaking communities and a wider dry stone tradition. Yet evidence did not end the argument immediately, because the argument had never been only about evidence. A settler state claiming the land benefited from a past in which Africans appeared incapable of complex government, long-distance trade, or monumental architecture. The false history made conquest look like civilization. The true history made conquest look like dispossession. Great Zimbabwe's carved birds became more than archaeological objects. The Zimbabwe bird now appears on the national flag. A form removed under colonial rule became a symbol of restored African authorship. The final recovery is therefore not the discovery that Africans built Great Zimbabwe. Local origin has been established for generations. The recovery is of agency. African communities selected granite, organized labor, managed the landscape, shaped trade, and made political choices. They adapted over time and preserved meanings that archaeology alone cannot fully replace. Return to the stone bird. At first it seemed to watch a mystery, mortarless walls, an unexplained tower, and a city whose softer buildings had disappeared. But survival and prejudice created much of that mystery. Granite remained while houses returned to soil. Colonial writers treated the missing evidence as proof that Africans could not have made what still stood. The evidence restores a chain of human decisions. Builders raised stone over generations. Households farmed, herded, and crafted, while rare imports moved through layered African networks. Clay became architecture and, in some pits, possible water storage. Political relationships turned a dispersed landscape into a center without creating a permanently packed metropolis. When those relationships changed, Great Zimbabwe contracted rather than vanishing on one date. Monumental buildings slowed, other centers rose, and occupation continued in changing forms. The site retained sacred importance. Its history was not waiting in silence for European discovery. The most violent rupture came when colonial investigators removed objects, stripped deposits, and searched for foreign builders. Archaeology later confirmed local African authorship, but it could not restore every destroyed layer. The Zimbabwe bird became a national emblem because recovery was never only about an artifact. It was about restoring cause and authorship to the people from whom both had been taken. The bird no longer presides over a lost civilization. It points to a living sequence of building, farming, trading, storing, moving, denying, and reclaiming. Great Zimbabwe's achievement is not simply that stone survived. It is that the surviving stone can now lead us back toward the African communities, landscapes, and relationships that made the city possible.